Hi, I'm Tim Haughton, reader in European politics at the University of Birmingham, and I've been the editor of the JCMS Annual Review of the European Union since 2008. We've heard a lot in this referendum campaign about sovereignty, about control, about power and influence, but not a lot of the discussion has been accurate. How much power, how much influence do we have as a member state of the European Union, and how much more control would we have if we left? If you agree to join any club, you agree to abide by the rules. If you join any international organisation, you agree to pool sovereignty. Being a member of NATO, for example, includes Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an attack on one member state is an attack on all. And we, as members of NATO, agree to defend that fellow member state under attack, just as they would be obliged to come to our defence if we were attacked. The EU, though, involves the pooling of much more sovereignty than for most international organisations. As my first-year undergraduates know well, the European Union is a complicated system. The EU is a unique set of institutional arrangements which blend together what political scientists like me call supranational and intergovernmental elements. Supranational means above the national, and intergovernmental means between the national governments. Much media coverage of the EU suggests that supranational bodies like the Commission are really powerful. The Commission does have powers, but the key decision-making and legislative bodies are intergovernmental. The Commission generates proposals, some of which are good, some not so good, but it doesn't decide. The key decision-making bodies are the intergovernmental ones. Legislation is made by a mixture of the European Parliament, which is directly elected by citizens, and the Council, made up of ministers from each of the member states. Ministers like George Osborne and Michael Gove sit around the table and decide on the proposals. And the big decisions are made by the European Council. These are the meetings of the heads of government. David Cameron, Angela Merkel, François Hollande sit around this table. And the really big decisions form parts of treaties. These treaties have to be agreed by every member state. The UK, like any other member state, can veto a treaty. The accession of all new countries involves a treaty, which means the European Parliament, the European Council, and the national political system, through a referendum or a vote in Parliament, would have to approve any accession of any new state. In other words, Turkey will only become a member state if the UK agrees. And that's before we talk about the complex negotiation process. In other words, decisions are not made by faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, but by our directly elected representatives and our politicians. It may not be a perfectly democratic system, but then the UK has the House of Lords and an unelected monarch as our head of state. Of course, these are collective decisions, so we don't always get what we want. But of the 2,634 decisions made by the Council between 1999 and 2016, the UK voted in favour 95% of the time. It abstained 3% of the time and disagreed 2% of the time. The European Parliament plays an increasingly important role in EU decision-making. In fact, we can say that legislation is made by a combination of the Council and the European Parliament. So elected MEPs can have a significant influence over decisions. And it's worth stressing in general that virtually nothing happens in the European Union without the big three, i.e. the UK, France and Germany, being in control of it. The UK, for example, was at the forefront of the single market. Without British influence, the single market may not have been created. It's also worth stressing that the last UK government, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, undertook a massive study of the powers of the EU known as the Balance of Competences Review. The conclusion from that huge study was that the balance between the European Union institutions and the member states was about right. So what would happen if we left? Well, clearly we wouldn't be outvoted in the Council. But then again, we wouldn't be around the table influencing the decision. If we had a Norwegian-style arrangement, we would remain subject to those single market rules. But of course, we would have no say over what those rules would be. So those rules are likely to become much more beneficial to other states in Europe rather than to ourselves. To have power and influence, you need to be sat around the table. In short, we are not fed a diet of Brussels by the EU. In fact, we play an integral role in cooking up and preparing the dishes in Brussels. Leaving would mean we would have no say over the menu, and we might have to make do with just the crumbs.